Thank you all for joining us. I'm Lori McGinley. I am a health and medical reporter here at the Post. I'm delighted today to introduce to you Scott Gottlieb, the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. Since being sworn in May, Dr. Gottlieb has been very, very busy. He's been working on the opioid crisis, generic drug approvals, and the high cost of drugs and drug development, which is something that honestly we don't often hear about from the FDA, so that's very interesting. On cancer, Dr. Gottlieb has personal experience. He was successfully treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2007. And that gives him a unique perspective along with other cancer survivors. One final note before we get going. For those of you in the audience and people watching online, you can send us your questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PostLive, or you can comment on our Facebook live stream. Dr. Gottlieb, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by talking about something that we've already heard about today, which was the big news last month when FDA approved the first of its kind immunotherapy to treat childhood leukemia. As I'm sure most of you know, this involved an approach called CAR T-cell therapy that uses a patient's own genetically modified cells to seek out and attack cancer. At the time of the approval, you said that it was a big deal and that we were entering a new frontier. Why was this advance so important? Why was the approval so important? And what were you referring to when you said that there is more to come?
Well, it was a significant milestone on multiple levels. I think the most meaningful of which was that it was the first gene therapy product approved in the United States. And there had been one previously approved in Europe, but this was the first approval in the United States, and it was a first approval of a product that looks to be highly effective. And I think, we've been working with gene therapy as a concept for many years, for decades, and we've had a lot of false starts and some tragedies along the way, and a lot of challenges. And I think we finally reached an inflection point in science where we have the techniques sufficiently perfected to actually allow these products to be translated into therapies for humans, and that's what we're seeing. And this was the first one, but there's literally hundreds behind it. I think we have more than 500 active INDs in-house at FDA for various gene therapy products. And so we're going to start seeing hopefully other approvals of products. The inflection point, I think, in the science of gene therapy probably came with the advent of vectors that were effective for delivering the gene and not causing side effects. For a while, we were using vectors that either wouldn't effectively deliver the gene or themselves would have certain side effects associated with them that created toxicities. And I think we're finally at a point in science where we understand enough about how to do this, that we're starting to see the use of more effective vectors, and in some cases highly effective vectors. And that really was the turning point in the availability of these treatments. The other significant component of this was the application itself. You're effectively using the tools of gene therapy to modify T cells to allow the patient's own immune cells to attack their cancer. And that's obviously a highly novel approach to the treatment of cancer, where we're trying to use immunology and immunotherapy to personalize a treatment to attack someone's cancer. So the days of systemic therapy where we poison the whole body with the hopes that we would poison the cancer cells more, a lot of cancers are still treated that way, but we're now starting to see immunotherapy become more an integral part of cancer treatment. And the use of CAR T is another big milestone, turning point, I think, in that approach.
You said at the time that the FDA stands ready and has taken steps to expedite the review and approval of these products. What were you referring to?
Well, so we have certain authorities like breakthrough therapy pathway, which allow us to expedite the approval of products that target unmet medical needs and look like they're going to be a significant breakthrough, a significant advance in the treatment of a disease that otherwise isn't impacted by available therapy. And so we have things like fast track and accelerated approval that you're familiar with, where you can get earlier approval, for example, on the basis of a surrogate measure of clinical benefit. But the other thing we're doing when it comes to some of these new biologics, of which CAR T is one, when you look in the FDA's Biologics Center at the products like the gene therapy products or cell therapy products, is we're starting to take steps to have more engagement with sponsors very early in the development process, because we find with some of these very novel platforms, there's more uncertainty about what the expectations are, especially when you're the first one to come through. And so for a lot of these very novel technologies, we're having much more extensive earlier engagement, even pre-IND, even before companies come in and ask for permission to submit an application to FDA to ask for the ability to go into human studies. We'll take meetings with them to discuss the potential development approach.
I think that for most patients, for most cancer patients, although I think this probably goes for any disease, of course, that what patients really care about is safety, effectiveness, and increasingly about cost. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the CAR T-cell therapy clocks in at $475,000 for a treatment, which is intended to be curative. But we'll get back to cost in a second. I wanted to start with safety for a minute. So in talking about your intention to expedite things at the FDA and make things more efficient, and certainly President Trump talked about that as well. How much faster can the FDA get? The FDA is already one of the fastest drug review agencies in the world. And do you have any concerns that at some point, if you keep accelerating, that you're going to compromise safety?
Well, I think when we talk about efficiency and you talk about speed in the review process, when I talk about it, I'm not talking about review times. I'm not talking about application review times, because you're right, we are very efficient. We review applications in a matter of months, 8 to 10 months, depending on the review cycle that an application's on. And most of the applications for the new molecular entities are decisions made on the first cycle of review. So they're not undergoing multiple cycles of review by the agency, where the agency reviews it, says we can't make a decision, asks the sponsor to do more work. So it's very efficient. I think where we can have an impact is on the development timeline, where the FDA does have an impact on how long it takes to actually do the clinical studies to develop a product by virtue of the kinds of requirements that the FDA asks for. How you structure clinical trials, the kinds of clinical evidence that the agency asks for, how you do preclinical studies, maybe in toxicology studies, whether you're doing them in assays or in animals, for example. There's different ways that we can incorporate new technology and new methodologies to make that process more efficient. And I think if we're doing our job in terms of thinking about the new science and how you can make the process of drug development itself more efficient and more scientifically rigorous. This isn't a binary assumption. This isn't a binary choice where if we can reduce development timelines on average, we're going to have less safe drugs. I think you can actually reduce development timelines and have a higher assurance of safety and efficacy if what you're doing is scientifically sound and you're incorporating better methodologies. And that's what we've talked about. And I talked about that recently in a series of speeches I gave, looking at things like seamless clinical trial designs or master protocols where you allow the study of multiple indications within the confines of the same clinical trial, or you look at enriched trial design where you're successively enriching the clinical trial for characteristics that you think correlate with patient response. And so by the time you're done with the clinical trial, you have a whole set of descriptive data that describes which patients are more likely to have a therapeutic benefit. But you've also potentially shortened your development timeline because you've enriched the trial for patients who are more likely to benefit, so you can see the benefit earlier. These are just some of the approaches. We've found opportunities to use assays, cellular and tissue assays that could be more descriptive in terms of looking at toxicology than maybe doing studies in animals, and we've incorporated those into the development process. So these are places where I think you can adopt better science and actually have a more efficient development process. The problem is that, you know, we're reluctant to change sometimes, and if we don't change, sponsors don't change. So if people have done something a certain way for a long period of time, and you have comfort with the certainty of the results you're going to get, it's hard to change, especially with so much at stake. If what's at stake is the ability to tell whether a drug is safe and effective, you don't want to change methodologies until you're very certain that you're actually going to get a better result. And so innovating that process from both a regulatory standpoint as well as on the part of sponsors is hard, it's slow, and I think it needs a concerted effort by leadership across the entire community, because you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to switch from one methodology to another only to find out years later that actually your first approach was a better way of answering the question.
Well, and this would be why the drug companies would need some additional contact or reassurance from the FDA that they're going down the right path. This
is why we need to do things, this is why things are done in a transparent process, often through notice and comment, either rulemaking or guidance. But, you know, in order, I think, to give the development community comfort that a new methodology can not only be a better approach to something that you've done, but actually will be embraced by the regulatory authorities. We have to go through a very deliberate process where we have workshops, where we socialize it, and where we ultimately develop written guidance documents articulating what the new standard would be. And that's what we've tried to do. So we've put out a series of documents related to guidance on how to do clinical trials, how to use Bayesian tools, statistical tools in clinical trials, or adaptive approaches, all these things that I've talked about, or incorporate different kinds of objective endpoints in the clinical trials as a way to evaluate both safety and benefit.
There's a lot of buzz about real-world evidence. This is a term that kind of eludes me. Can you just explain, what does that mean? Does that mean using information from electronic health records to support applications, or can you ever see a situation in which that kind of information would supplant a standard clinical trial, or what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, typically when we talk about real-world evidence, and definition, it means different things to different people. But typically we're talking about practical clinical data that's gleaned from routine clinical care, routine clinical practice. But it could be it could be data that's generated in the confines of a more structured approach, like a prospective registry. And so oftentimes, especially on the medical device side of our house, a lot of the data that is used, even for purposes of regulatory decision-making, is derived from prospective registries that are rigorously done, but it's data that's collected on top of routine clinical practice. And so it might be data that's collected in the context of an electronic health record. We do have wide latitude as a regulatory authority to use real-world evidence to supplant our clinical trial requirements. And so we do have latitude, for example, to approve a drug on the basis of a single study, and then supplant that single study with confirmatory evidence, substantial clinical experience, and that could be derived from real-world evidence. And so this already goes on. It especially is used in the context of drug safety, to evaluate drug safety in the post-market, but it's also increasingly used to help augment what we know about products on the questions of efficacy as well, particularly on the medical device side, but also on the drug side of our house.
So your goal in all of this is to get more drugs on the market, stimulate competition, and hopefully that could curb or maybe even drive down drug costs. And you've also said, well, first of all, is that correct?
Well, I think my goal running the agency is to get effective therapy to patients and get safe and effective products to patients, especially when we're looking at areas of new technology where some of these products have the potential to be transformative in human health. And I think that we want to make sure that we have an efficient route to market. The CAR T is one example of that this has the potential to transform the treatment of a cancer. The verdict's still out. We obviously have very good evidence about the short-term benefits. We're going to need more evidence around the long-term benefits and sustainability of the response. But these have the potential to be transformative treatments. I mean, we do have the potential with some of these new applications like gene therapy to cure inherited diseases, to cure things like beta thalassemia or blood illnesses like sickle cell disease. It isn't out of our reach within the next decade that we might be able to dramatically alter the course of some of these diseases. So my goal is to make sure we have a regulatory process that's as modern as the science we're being asked to evaluate and gets this to patients efficiently.
Well, you have said...
and to try to bring down drug costs.
I was going to say...
Good segue.
Because you have said that high drug costs or prices, depending on how you want to put it, are a public health issue, which I think is completely legitimate considering the studies that show that some people are not taking their cancer medications because they can't afford it, or people are facing high copays. Well, last January, President Trump said that the drug companies were getting away with murder on their pricing, and then there was a big flurry of activity about an executive order on drug prices possibly coming out. And then it just seemed to all disappear some months ago. Where does that stand? Where does the executive order on drug pricing stand? Does it exist?
Well, I'm not. I don't speak for the White House. You know that, Laura. Good try. I could talk to you about what we're doing. I think what we're doing with respect to drug pricing and drug competition could become a component of any policy that the administration puts out. But I don't know exactly what the White House is working on. You'd have to direct those questions there. But obviously, we're trying to do things on the generic drug side. We also have to think about the new drug side. I think that we've seen examples where when the second and third new drug enters a category, you see substantial price competition. And one of my concerns is that it's becoming, because the development costs are becoming so high, and the amount of investment you have to put in is so enormous now, you're seeing fewer and fewer categories where companies want to be the third or fourth to market. In fact, you're seeing oftentimes after the second or third drug comes to market in some of these categories, other companies will pull out. And so that could be a challenge going forward, because you might see less competition in these new drug categories. And to just pick up on the issues around the CAR T, I mean, that's a particular challenge when you have therapy where it's going to be very highly specialized. So this treatment is targeted to fewer than 200 patients a year, although the indication might be expanded. But also the cost of goods, the cost of the product itself are not trivial. In this case, it's probably tens of thousands of dollars, the product itself. And so that's going to be a particular challenge, how we finance this and how we make sure patients can get access to these.
And it's a one-time treatment.
And it's a one-time treatment. And so you have a one-time administration, a one-time cost. And so how do you, these are sort of policy questions that are outside my current purview, but how do you think about how you amortize those costs, spread them out so it's not a one-time hit to the system, especially if we come up with the ability to cure a pediatric disease, an inherited disease where you might want to deliver it to everyone at one time. Those could be substantial costs to the entire healthcare system.
What did you think you I'm not sure how much you were involved in the Novartis, which is the maker of the CAR T-cell therapy called Kymriah, decision to issue this money-back guarantee that if the patient did not respond within the first month, that the patient wouldn't have to pay for the therapy. What do you think about that? And are we going to see more of that? And what happens when a third of those patients relapse after a year? Should they get a partial refund, or what should happen then?
Well, look, these are. I think we're going to see. To answer your first question, I think we're going to see more outcomes-based pricing for a lot of these treatments, especially treatments where the response is very binary, where you can get a dramatic result or no result at all. In terms of how we make a decision about what endpoint you're measuring, I mean, those are the kinds of things that are going to be negotiated out between the technology developers and the payers. But that's also the complexity of having these outcomes-based contracts. Sometimes it's hard to decide what benefit you're going to measure or how long you're going to measure it over. And that's been the challenge with these in the past is, oftentimes drug response isn't binary, or it's hard to measure. But I think you do have treatments now, this one and others perhaps behind it, where you will see a binary response. You might not know the durability of the response at the outset, but you're going to see a clear effect, and you're going to know whether or not the patient had a clear response to a product. And so those kinds of constructs will lend themselves to these outcomes-based contracts. That's why I think we're going to see more of it in the future.
I was interested in, you said in your statement last week about trying to lower drug development costs, that you hoped and expected that some of the savings would go to consumers. What makes you think that would happen? And is there anything that you could do to make that happen?
Right. Look, it's not a one-on-one correlation. There's complex economic models, and I know people in a competitive market, in a dynamic market, price things to the price that they can derive and what they perceive the value to be and what the value is to the end recipient. So simply lowering the development costs, products aren't priced based on some multiple of what they cost to develop them. But from my standpoint, when you look at development costs that can clearly top $1 billion in direct outlays, and I know there's estimates about what the time cost of capital is and what the imputed costs of all the failed clinical studies are, and then that gets you to figures like $2.6 billion, which is a figure that's sometimes quoted by the industry. But we can all agree it's really expensive. And I think if it continues to remain very expensive and continues to grow at the rate that it is, and a rate that by many measures is in excess of even the significant rates of increases in the prices, we're going to see fewer drugs come into these categories and less competition. And that certainly will impact prices, because we know, and we have objective evidence, I don't want to cite specific drug categories, but we do have objective evidence where when the second or third drug comes to the market in a new drug category, you see significant competition. You see payers have the ability to negotiate significant price discounts, oftentimes in excess of even what the discounts are that are extracted by governments in Europe. And hepatitis C is one such category, to name one example, where you saw pricing come down significantly according to public reports I think you've published after multiple drugs came into the market. And so you want to have an economic model that allows the second and third and perhaps the fourth drug to come into the market, not only because it brings competition, but it also brings product differentiation that could be important to a subset of patients that might only respond to one particular iteration of a product. And I think when you're looking at direct development costs that easily top $1 billion for some of these products, the economic model becomes more and more challenging looking out into the future, and that does concern me.
What about biosimilars? How big an answer are they to the problem? The FDA just approved its first biosimilar for a cancer drug for Avastin.
Right.
And I think the agency, correct me if I'm wrong, has approved maybe a half a dozen other biosimilars for other diseases. What are you seeing in terms of the adoption, the uptake by the doctors, by the providers? And are you comfortable with the rate of adoption?
Well, we currently have 10 applications in-house. We have 27 sponsors that have asked for guidance on applications. And so the pipeline in-house at FDA isn't exceedingly robust, but behind that we see a lot of development activity. And so I think we're going to see a real pickup in the rate of biosimilar development. I think we're at the early stages of biosimilars, similar to where we were 30 years ago with generic drugs, where adoption is slow. There is reluctance on the part of providers to switch over, certainly to switch patients off of therapy that they're on onto a biosimilar, or even to embrace a biosimilar, especially if you're thinking about curative therapy. And so we're going to have to continue to educate providers. We're spending some money on the part of FDA to go out and do some public education campaigns to educate providers about the robustness of the process that biosimilars go through. But I think it's going to be slow adoption. I think this is an opportunity where the payers might have a role to play by guaranteeing perhaps some market share to some of the biosimilars that are coming onto the market and in driving the adoption themselves. Because what I worry about, and then taking off my FDA hat for a moment, but what I worry about is if the adoption rates continue to be slow, then the potential manufacturers of biosimilars won't see this as a viable opportunity and won't make the investments in the first place. If they don't think that they can capture 20 or 30% market share within the first 5 years of being on the market, or whatever the economic model is, they might say, you know what, when this is a category we're going to stay away from. So I think the payers have an opportunity to perhaps think about guaranteeing some market share and then putting the obligation on themselves for having to drive adoption. If we don't think a little bit differently about this and do something potentially disruptive, it could be a very slow ramp. And I do think that these have the potential to provide important competition in categories where the products right now could be exceedingly expensive.
You've said very nice things about Richard Pastor, who's head of the Oncology Center for Excellence, and I think has instituted some of the things that you're talking about in terms of new types of trials. And I was interested to find out. My understanding is that the funding is kind of hung up on the Oncology Center, and that the funding that people thought was going to get there has not gotten there. Can you tell me what's going on there and how it might be resolved?
Well, to your point about Rick talking about some of the things I'm talking about, Rick actually pioneered some of the things I'm talking about and wrote my talk points for me. So I mean, I'm talking about the things that Rick really invented and championed, and I've adopted them as a matter of policy. So the issue with the Oncology Center for Excellence is this is a combined program between our Biologics Center and our Drug Center to try to consolidate the different aspects of oncology product development into one program. And this is a format that we would like to replicate in other therapeutic areas. This was the first one that we did. The money that was supposed to be allocated to the development of this program was allocated through the NIH, and it was supposed to be given to FDA. And not to get sort of to government speak on you, but it's not so easy for the NIH to write us a check. We didn't know that at the time that it was allocated in this way. So we're going to need to see how we could fix that in order to make sure the program gets the allocation that Congress intended.
I think since this is a cancer event, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your tobacco initiative. And during the summer, you announced a new comprehensive tobacco regulatory framework with a couple of different prongs, so to speak. Could you tell us your thinking about it and what the next step is on that?
So this is an effort to put nicotine at the center of our tobacco regulatory efforts and view nicotine really as the problem, both the problem and the potential solution to cigarette addiction. What kills people from cigarette smoking isn't the nicotine, although nicotine isn't a completely benign substance, especially in a developing brain in a young child. What kills people are all the carcinogens that are attached to tobacco when tobacco is combusted. And so the first part of this effort is to regulate nicotine levels in combustible cigarettes, to try to reduce nicotine levels to minimally addictive or non-addictive levels and reduce the addictive attractiveness of cigarettes. So we don't hook a whole new generation of smokers onto cigarettes, and so that people who want to get access to nicotine look to other potentially less harmful products than the tobacco, than the combustible cigarettes. At the same time, we pushed off application deadlines that were due on certain non-combustible products, including e-cigarettes. If we had not done that, they were facing a cliff where they would have been swept from the market. And so what we're doing is putting in place regulations to put those products through an appropriate series of regulatory gates while we allow them to continue to advance and innovate. This is new product innovation that has the potential to be a lot less harmful than combusting tobacco for those people who still want to get access to satisfying levels of nicotine. So, our view was at the very time that we're taking decisive action to try to reduce nicotine in cigarettes to non-addictive levels, we need to provide an alternative for adults who still want to get access to nicotine, and the new, what we call ENDS, electronic nicotine delivery systems, of which e-cigarettes are a prominent component, provide one alternative potentially for a safer route for patients to still get access, or people to still get access to nicotine. At the same time, we're going to be taking steps also to look at the medicinal side of our house and how we can allow more product innovation when it comes to nicotine replacement products regulated as drugs, so the OTC products, again, to make sure that we're providing proper avenues for people who want to get access to nicotine, adults who want to get access to nicotine, to be able to do it without having to combust tobacco.
What do you say to people who say that's all fine and good, but the FDA could have done the reduced nicotine years ago because it had the authority, and it never did? And in the meantime, now the regulation of these e-cigarettes, which people don't really know what's in them, has been pushed off a number of years.
Well, the regulation of the e-cigarettes wasn't pushed off. There's the so-called newly deemed products, of which e-cigarettes are one, are fully regulated by FDA. So we can enforce GMP standards. We can and will continue to do inspections of manufacturers. We require warnings on labels. All of those regulations are still in effect. What we've pushed off are the product applications, and under the provision, the products would effectively have been swept from the market. And so, I don't think it would have been good public policy at the very point at which we're trying to regulate nicotine to non-addictive levels in the combustible forms of tobacco, not to provide a pathway towards alternative delivery of nicotine for people who still want to get access to it. And we're going to have a whole generation of smokers, some of whom are still going to want to get access to nicotine through vehicles that could replicate the experience of smoking. And what are we going to do for those people? So these provide a potential solution, a potential alternative for adults who want to get access to them. So, we're going to use the reason why we picked the amount of time we did for how long we were pushing off those application deadlines is because that's the amount of time it's going to take us to get implementing regulations in place to put those products through an appropriate series of regulatory gates. But we're still going to be continuing to regulate them and oversee those products even while we extend the application deadlines.
Can you tell us, before we wrap up, a little bit about your experience dealing with cancer? You were 33 and deputy commissioner at the FDA, and what happened?
I found the kind of lesion on myself that only a hypochondriac physician would have found. It was very early stage. It was stage 1A. Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was just a single, almost a mass that almost couldn't be palpable. But I felt a fullness in my axilla, my left axilla, and ignored it like some people do. Most people would do for a little bit of time, and then one day said this doesn't feel right and went to the doctor. and was diagnosed with a CAT scan, and probably a CAT scan that nobody would have had, nobody in this room would have had unless you were the deputy commissioner of the FDA walking into a general practitioner's office one morning. I think that she had a heightened sense of concern that she shouldn't miss something, but I'm grateful for that. I think I went through a very traditional chemotherapy regimen: adriamycin, bleomycin, vinblastine, dacarbazine, Rituxan. So it was a tough 6 months of chemo. I did most of it while I was still working at the FDA. But I think the hardest part for me wasn't the physical aspects of the treatment, but the uncertainty. Probably the hardest parts were that first weekend when I knew I had a mass in my chest, but I didn't know what it was. I'm a physician, so I spent the whole weekend online and going through medical textbooks, and I said, could it be metastatic colon cancer? I was going through all the permutations of the worst thing it could be. When I got the diagnosis, I obviously had some reassurance because it was a very curable cancer. But there was still a lot of uncertainty with the treatment regimen. Would I relapse? Would it shrink? And that was the hardest part. I think the mental aspects of it were exceedingly difficult for me, and I think they are for most people.
And
the physical,
how has it affected how you approach your job or how you think about it?
I think it's affected how I think about my job insofar as, for me, I was a patient who was told you have a 90% chance of a cure, and I was trying to figure out how do I get 90% to 92% or 93%. And the way to do that was to scour the literature and look for the most decisive studies I could find about how to structure my regimen. I had to make decisions: do I use radiation or not, or do I try Rituxan, which was experimental at the time, now is used more commonly. So I was looking for data. I wanted data. I think for patients who are diagnosed and told, you have a 20% chance of surviving 5 years, that's a very different situation. And what that patient's looking for is something new. They're looking for a silver bullet. They're looking for something experimental, because for them, the available therapy has failed. And I think that there's a lot of different kinds of cancer patients, but I think there's two ends of that spectrum. And I think about that a lot, because I was in a different position. And I think that when we talk about, trying to get really rigorous data and very large clinical trials, that serves me, my kind of patient, very well. Someone who has available therapy that's effective, but is looking for it to get their odds up. But if we prolong that process in search of very pristine data, we might not be serving the other patient very well, the one who's looking for something early, something experimental, because for them the available therapy just isn't sufficient.
Well, Dr. Gottlieb, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we've really enjoyed having you, and we will be back in a few minutes, and thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.